Good morning. I'm Sherman Stanford, and this is Making Sense of the Chaos. If we're to make sense of the chaos, we have to have a framework through which to see what's going on around us in the world. And if we're Christians, that framework ought to be to see the world as God sees it. So there are 8 fundamental facts that ought to establish that framework. Probably you can expand that list to 20 or 30 or 50, but I think these 8 facts will give us an adequate framework to see what's going on where we're not going to get too terribly lost, and then you can fine tune as you go along down the line. But most of the world is unaware of most of these, and even if they do know some of these, they have a distorted view of them, which means they have a distorted view of reality, and a distorted view of reality works itself out into a distorted view of what you should do, which works itself out into doing wrong things. And wrong actions result in grief and heartache for you and the people you love. They're also unfaithful to God, which should be our most important consideration, the fundamental consideration. As creatures of His, and especially as no longer rebels, but rather as submissive servants of His, our first desire should be to please and honor Him. So if we're going to do that, let's bear these truths in mind. First, God created the cosmos for His own glory, not for mankind's glory. Second, the jewel of creation is mankind. Third, although in no sense the author of evil, God, as the sovereign, predestinating God of the universe, ordained Adam's fall. You understand, if that's not true, then it means that He couldn't have known Adam would fall, and He couldn't have worked His purposes out in His great plan if the very first act in the unfolding of that grand drama never occurred. Fourth, in Adam, the entire creation fell, including all of mankind and all of the physical cosmos. Fifth, as a result of the fall, 2 things immediately happened. One is God pronounced the blessing of the coming Messiah, although it was couched in terms that were not clearly apparent at that time, but He spoke of the seed of the woman, and He declared enmity between that seed of the woman, who is going to be Jesus Christ and all those in Him, enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, which would be, of course, Satan, fallen Adam, all of humanity to come would be born into that category. And that enmity would last until the judgment day. This is the great antithesis. Sixth, after that occurred, all of human social experience, all interactions between human beings are a reflection of that great antithesis, because everybody you meet belongs to one or the other of those 2 great divisions. And they're either in the same group that you're in or they're not. And God has declared how you're supposed to respond to people in either division. Whether you recognize that or not, you will be acting in terms either of faithfulness to that antithesis or unfaithfulness to that antithesis. And I assure you, the people who blur the line between these 2 divisions are not the seed of the woman. The seed of the serpent, or not the seed of the serpent, the seed of the woman will blur the lines. The seed of the serpent is always aware that they hate Jesus, they hate God, and they hate His people. I ought to know. I came right out of that seed. And if you came out of that seed, you know that you hated Jesus. Oh, I didn't hate Jesus. Yeah, well, right. You didn't hate Him as long as He was an idea over there in the corner. As long as He wasn't making demands upon you. But as soon as He said what you were supposed to do with what you thought you had a right to do your own way with, and He said no, no, then you didn't love him then. You didn't even like him, you hated him. Seventh, the unregenerate, all those who remain in Adam, are without excuse. They know God because he has made himself plain in the things that are created, and they deny him. They suppress that truth in unrighteousness. Remember, it's like holding a ball filled with air underwater. It takes pressure to keep it underwater. And they pretend that they don't know they're holding that ball underwater, and there's a sense in which they have fooled themselves. That's true. But in the ultimate sense, no, they're dishonest, and they know the truth, but they don't want to face the truth, because facing the truth means they have to surrender their rebellion. Since the most ridiculous thing that you can imagine in the world is for a human being to be at war with his own creator. That's absurd. It's the height of stupidity. And eighth, never forget this, the word of the cross is foolishness. It's moronic, Paul tells us, to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. All right? That's a not fun thing to think about, because we don't want to be seen as morons. But if you're going to stand for the gospel, the world is going to see you as a moron. If you're uncomfortable with that, then you just need to remember that God says, Jesus Christ said, if you deny me before men, I will deny you before the Father. Well, there's your choice. There's your choice. You can have men think you're a moron, or God know you are. Because he calls all those who deny him fools, remember? So you can be a fool for God, a moron for God, or you can be a fool for people, and God will regard you as a fool. That's up to you. Today, we're going to talk about the Reformed view of the proper relationship of church and state. Now, remember, the Reformers were those men who launched the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. The first, of course, was Martin Luther. He was followed by Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich, Theodore Beza, William Farel, Philip Melanchthon, and in my view, the most important of all the reformers, John Calvin. And they had views on a lot of things, because they regarded the Christian faith as all-encompassing, that it affects every area of life, that it's not tucked off into a corner, that God is not sovereign over a corner of heaven, and on earth men are sovereign. They didn't believe that, because you see, they had read this book called the Bible. And so I'm going to take the liberty of reading some of that book to you this morning, because you need to get a context for the discussion of church and state. And the context has to be, what does God say about that? If God created everything, then it makes no sense to think of the state, of the government, as somehow neutral or existing over there without any regard to what God has to say. It's a separate power that God has nothing to do with, and it's allowed to do whatever it wants, and God says, oh, well, look at them, I'm only worried about spiritual things. No, God's not worried just about spiritual things. God is concerned about everything. He has a plan regarding his entire creation, and it covers every aspect of that creation: politics, aesthetics, everything, sports, everything, okay? And if we're going to take dominion for God, if we're going to rule the earth in his name, then we have to rule every aspect of the earth and every aspect of human behavior according to his word. What does he have to say about government? Well, let's look at Psalm 2. Okay. It says, now remember, Psalm 2 was written probably about 13 or 1400 years before Jesus was born. Okay? It says, why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision. Then he shall speak to them in his wrath and distress them in his deep displeasure. Yet I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree. The Lord has said to me, you are my son. Who is this son, I wonder? 13 or 1400 years before Jesus was born. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations of your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, be wise, O kings. Be instructed, you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way. And when his wrath is kindled but a little, blessed are those who put their trust in him. Okay, this was written to the nations, to the leaders of the nations. Okay? So God has a lot to say about the government, the earthly government of people. Now let's look at Psalm 110. Psalm 110 is the most quoted psalm in the New Testament. It's the most quoted passage from the Old Testament in the New Testament. It is, in fact, God's favorite passage that he has quoted in the New Testament. So pay attention. This is God's favorite Old Testament passage. We can tell that because it's quoted most often by God's own anointed scripture writers in the New Testament. So what does Psalm 110 say? The Lord said to, once again, this is written by David, King David, okay? 13 or 1400 years before Jesus was born. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord shall send the rod of your strength out of Zion, rule in the midst of your enemies. Okay? So, Jesus quoted this one and he said, how does David, who is David's Lord that he's speaking of here, if David's the one? Well, the Lord is Jesus Christ. And the last one I want to look at is from Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20. This is known as the Great Commission. This is the Great Commission. Pay attention carefully to what Jesus says, because these are the words of Jesus Christ. Then Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. All authority, where? In heaven. And where else? On earth. Right here. All authority. Did he really mean that? Well, that's what he said. That's what he meant. Anyone who would presume to exercise any authority on earth at all, anywhere, in any corner of the earth, exercises that authority subject to the authority of Jesus. Jesus is his boss. Do you understand that? The mayor of your city, the city councilman in your city, the governor of your state, the president of the United States, the Supreme Court, the Congress, all of these people exercise their authority under the authority of Jesus Christ. They owe him and will have to give him an explanation for how they use the authority that he granted to them. You think, well, he didn't grant authority to them. We did. We're the people. We elected them. And who made the people and who controls the desires of the people and therefore the way they're going to vote? It's God. It's all God. God is sovereign. He's not sovereign of a little bit. He's not sovereign over here and not over there. He's sovereign everywhere. He's sovereign all the time. And what else did he say? Go therefore and make disciples of the nations. The nations? Which nations? All the nations. Make disciples of them, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. The end of the age means to the judgment day. The Greek word used is sunteleia. It's used 6 times in the Bible, and all 6 times it means the judgment day. So Jesus is going to be with us as his ambassadors, his missionaries, as we disciple the nations. The nations. He didn't say the people in all the nations. He says disciple the nations. What's a nation? What's a political subdivision? Ruled by a king or a president or a premier or a dictator or whatever. But if we're supposed to be discipling the nations, what does discipling mean? When you discipline your child, you're discipling him. What are you doing? You're teaching them, your child, to obey you. So when we disciple the nations, we're teaching the nations to obey whom? Jesus. All right? So this is the context that the reformers considered the question of church and state. Okay, so keep that in mind. What's the significance of that? Well, the reformers were simply the Reformation was the most significant historical event in the history of mankind after the year 100 AD. The most significant historical event. Christianity consolidated, clarified its thinking, made the greatest gains intellectually, morally, religiously, and in every way during that period. It doesn't mean they didn't make a lot of mistakes, but it means that was a point of focus, of clarification, and looking at the thinking of those men will help us to clarify our thinking today in assessing the very same issues that they looked at that time. All right? Before we even get there, let's think for a moment about the idea of progress, because I believe there's an underlying assumption that we have. It's an evolutionistic assumption that if you just allow time to pass, that necessarily people will make progress. Well, let's think about that. Let's think about that. Let's think about a single human being that you know very well. Let's say that he wears your shoes and he wears your clothes, and when you look in the mirror, he's the person you're looking at. Okay? It's you we're going to talk about. Let's say that you get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and you go to bed at 10 o'clock at night. The intervening 16 hours, when they pass, every day, when you go to bed, you lay your head on that pillow, and you know that you have made progress this day in your life. Is that correct? No, that's not correct. There are many days that you simply spun your wheels that day. Other days, you slipped back in many areas. You did not make progress. You may have made progress in one area, but in other areas, you lost ground. Are all your relationships better day by day? Or do some of your relationships sour over time? Of course they do. So, if we look at your life, or we look at my life, because I assure you, my life is not a picture of steady progress day by day by day. No. I'm like you. I'm a sinner saved by grace and subject to the pull of sin. Bill and I We studied yesterday Romans 7, specifically the passage talking about Paul's struggle with sin, and both of us had to admit that we struggle the same way that he did, that our lives are not a series of going from one victory to another victory with no defeats ever interspersed in that landscape. Oh, no. And that's not true of you. It's not true of anybody. Now, what are people taken in the aggregate except individuals multiplied by, in America, let's say multiplied by 330 million. Well, if we take 330 million people like you and like me, who make progress some days and other days don't make progress, then we have to understand that all of us are not making progress just because time is passing. If we make progress, how do we measure the progress? We have to measure it against the standard. What's the standard? Well, if the standard is my feelings, then my progress is a roller coaster. But let's say that I wanted to become a faster sprinter at 100 meters. Now, at my age, probably my goal ought to be running a 15 flat 100 meters. but let's say I'm running a 20 flat 100 meters right now. And my goal is to run a 15 flat. Well, how do I figure out whether I'm making progress toward meeting my goal? You think maybe I need to time myself at 100 meters from time to time, or even at other distances which might indicate my progress toward that time at 100 meters. But I have to be timing myself, and I have to always be looking at the goal. What's the goal? The goal is to run a 15 flat, right? Very modest goal, I understand. But it doesn't matter what your goal is. If you have a goal, you can only know whether you're making progress toward that goal by knowing what the goal is, right? You got to know where you are and where you want to go. Well, let's say that I was a young guy, 25 years old, and I was really fast. And if my goal was to run a 15 flat 100 meters, but I can already run a 10 flat 100 meters, do you think my goal makes any sense? Well, no, it doesn't. So your goal is always based upon two things. That is, where you are now and where you want to end up. Right? Well, it's not too hard to figure out where you are now. But even then, it does take some thought. But then it really takes some thought about where you want to end up, what's reasonable, what's the standard that you ought to be following. Well, the standard for Christians, and the standard for everybody really, is what does God say about how we should be acting. And if he says this is how we should be acting, then that's the standard. All right, so in our own lives personally, the standard is God's 10 Commandments, and I submit to you that that same standard is the standard that's to be applied to the state. It needs to be following the 10 Commandments in the same way. Now, it has different duties than you do, but that doesn't mean it's allowed to make its own rules and to make its own standard. It exists under God's authority just like you do. Okay? So, in addition to the redirection of Christianity and its consequent redirection of Western European culture toward a God-centered faith paradigm, the reformers, particularly Martin Luther and John Calvin, labored faithfully in developing a God-centered, Bible-based view of the proper relationship between the political realm, as embodied by the various kings and kingdoms, and the scattered congregations of the Reformed churches. To avoid confusion, we will refer to the two realms as state and church. That ought to be pretty simple, huh? Prior to the marriage of the Roman Catholic Church to the Roman Empire in the 4th century, as we said earlier, the church was politically weak and socially and culturally diffuse. The relationship between church and state was largely one of neglect by the empire, with occasional eruptions of hostility and violence by it directed against the church. From the perspective of the church, contact with the empire was kept to a minimum, with the church making every effort to keep a low political profile to better ensure its survival. Now, church leaders understood that the gospel is fundamentally a subversive teaching. If Jesus is the Lord, then it means that in the same sense that Jesus is Lord, Caesar cannot be Lord. So to avoid open confrontation with the government, what they did is they pretty much just tried to keep a low profile. To greater or less success as time went by. As mentioned earlier, following Constantine's adoption of Christianity in 312 AD, as the official state church, the dynamic between church and state was dramatically altered. Although the duties and obligations, the sphere of activity, of church and state differed, there was never a clear delineation of power in respect to one another. Nobody sat down and said, okay, this is what the state is responsible for. This is what the church is responsible for. Here's the line of division. Don't cross it. Nobody sat down and did that. And so the line was fuzzy and it slid one way and it slid the other way. Nor was there a clear and sustained idea either of the proper function of each individually or in relation to one another beyond the most basic principles. Obviously, the church didn't pass laws for the state, and the state didn't conduct religious services. But outside of those restrictions, there was a lot of trespassing back and forth. And even those basic principles that they did follow were subject to the varied personalities, their strengths and weaknesses of those possessing power, either in the church or in the state. As the fortunes of each institution waxed and waned in relation to its counterpart, tension and friction between them responded accordingly. Except for the most basic ritual functions of the church, the Roman Empire often claimed authority exercised by the church, especially in the beginning. I mean, there was no doubt that the Roman Empire's worldly power was far greater than the church's power. The church at that time, as the generally perceived weaker partner for its part, blurred the lines of authority even more egregiously than did the empire or any subsidiary political authority. Having less worldly power than the empire, uncertainty and ambiguity were often used by church leaders to try to create a power vacuum into which the church could step. Popes exercised religious authority, made treaties favoring one kingdom over another, amassed armies and went to war, winning and losing territory in precisely the ways political states did. They also frequently asserted claims to authority over civil powers, insisting on subservience by civil governmental heads over political issues only thinly veiled as religious. They would excommunicate political leaders for actually political reasons, although they would veil those as religious reasons. Anyway, getting a little sense of that tension that existed for, 12 centuries? 13 centuries? 12 centuries. Gives us some notion of the backdrop to the Reformation. To help resolve the tension, first Luther and then Calvin addressed the church-state issue. We will discuss in detail Calvin's thoughts as they appear in his writings, chiefly in his opus, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. I realize this was written 500 years ago and doesn't seem to have much significance to us today, especially as I said earlier with our idea that, well, in 500 years we made a lot of progress. And we have in a lot of ways. In a lot of other ways, we haven't made any progress at all. Man is still fallen. Man still needs a standard by which to guide his actions, and that standard is still God and his word. So we're going to look at what Calvin had to say and see how much he can help us in sorting our own thoughts out about what's the proper relationship of church and state. Where should we say this far and no further to the state? Where should the state say this far and no further to the church? Doing very sloppy work, historians have often concluded that John Calvin exercised authority over both the Reformed Church in Geneva and the city government itself. Not only are they wrong in the latter claim, but in his writings as well as in his practice, he advocated a strict separation between civil government and church government, although not along lines accepted by the modern mind. Okay. And at that point, I think we've used up our 30 minutes, so we'll pick up right there tomorrow and talk about how did Calvin see the separation of church and state, and how should we? Okay. Anyway, Bill, do you have anything you'd like to add to that? I think it's very important for us to understand these issues because right now, our political leaders, many of them, are trying to overstep the bounds. They're trying to become tin-pot Napoleons and petty tyrants, and to run our lives in ways that God does not permit them to do. And I don't know about you, but I much prefer being free to being in bondage. I don't like the government telling me that I can't tear a tag off a mattress. but I realize it's a silly example, but it is an example of how intrusive the government can be in your life and my life if we don't put that hand up and say, hey, stop. It's enough. God says this far and no further. So let's think about that. Pray God's blessing on you today and keep you safe. Remember, though, there are worse things to fear than death. And the worst of all is being unfaithful to God. God bless you. Have a wonderful day.